Designed in 1929, the Linguistic Atlas was created to find out how language really works by means of documenting dialects. As the years have progressed since the start of the Linguistic Atlas, researchers have noticed by taking a closer look at these dialects, they were able to find out how language actually works. These researchers have started to determine the way people speak in terms of accents or slurs. In a specific instance, Lee Pedersen, a man that set up the Linguistic Atlas during the 1960s, interviewed an elderly lady from Huntsville, Alabama. A specific excerpt of this interview, entailing descriptions of the topography that this lady has come in contact with, stood out to me because of my current major, landscape architecture. The way this lady responds to said questions, as well as the pronunciation of these answers, suggests that this lady is from Southern descent and is exceedingly intelligent, contrary to Southern stereotypes. Many contemplate over the issue of what exactly defines a true Southerner. Besides the fact that this lady was born in Huntsville, Alabama, there are plenty of other pieces of evidence that help show that this lady is from Southern descent. However, being as it may, there is not one true defining piece of evidence, but instead there are many different pieces that can play in part together to help interpret whether someone is a Southerner or not. For instance, accent certainly is a contributing factor that differentiates itself from other areas of the world. This lady's accent and her pronunciation of words are much different than those who live up in the northern United States. My aunt had been living in Vermont for the majority of her life after college and has just recently moved back to the South. Just by listening to her, there's clearly a difference in both pronunciation and accent when compared to someone like my father, who had been living here in the South for his entire life. It is funny how a simple different pronunciation of a word can help someone determine where the speaker had originated from. In many instances in the interview, the lady would throw out answers that Pedersen wouldn't have expected. For example, he asked the lady,
"What about a big rock face on a mountain that's maybe a couple of 100 feet high, or what?"
Her answer to that question was,
"Precipice."
Just by listening to his reaction to the answer, it is apparent that Mr. Pedersen didn't really expect that response, but instead something along the lines of a cliff. This example also plays in part with the preconceived notions of Southerners being unintelligent, or rather, less intelligent than others. Back throughout history, many citizens of the United States, mainly Northerners, viewed the South as unintelligent. This Southern stereotype suggested that Southerners were incapable of thinking abstractly, let alone having the ability to retain and recite knowledge at all. In the interview with the lady and Mr. Pedersen, there are instances that cause Pedersen to question preconceived notions of the typical Southerner. The bio written by Pedersen describes everything that dealt with the interview and how she was very intelligent and talkative, and her responses to direct questions were immediately and easily obtained. It can be inferred from past history that Southerners typically wouldn't be able to respond to such questions so efficiently, but that is what the Linguistic Atlas was precisely designed for. These researchers are studying to learn all forms of language, whether it be the language itself, or how the language works altogether. There is a story I can relate to in this particular excerpt of the interview. The lady began to ramble on about a story that certainly tested her knowledge of different forms of topography. What was interesting was that Mr. Pedersen never asked a direct question to her, so in my eyes, I felt like she was obligated to show all the knowledge she had gathered up through her life. I have witnessed a similar instance where my father's mother can relate to the lady. My grandmother has been living in the South for her entire life now, of around 80 years, and she still seems to be the strongest person I know to this day. These two ladies are related because in many instances, my grandmother feels obligated to overanalyze or over-explain herself to get her point across. In other words, whenever my grandmother and I are having a conversation, she would likely bring up a story that had some relevance to the issue we were discussing, and try to make ties that way to not only back up her knowledge, but try to explain things in an easier way to me. There is really no defining factor that helps label someone as a Southerner. Instead, there are many factors that can certainly affect one's decision in finding a Southerner. Today, the Linguistic Atlas is used to determine the way people speak, rather than solely how language works. Basically, we all understand that language is different over the regions of the country, but we are still unable to understand each other. In the interview between Lee Pedersen and the lady from Huntsville, Alabama, we not only learn of ways that define a true Southerner, but also a Southerner, contrary to many stereotypes, that was surprisingly intelligent. Typically, if one were to define a Southerner, They wouldn't necessarily look at topography as an issue that you could draw information from regarding Southern characteristics. People usually look to define Southerners through language, accents, and things like cooking. However, through this excerpt of the interview between the lady and Mr. Pedersen, it is found that there are many ways to define a Southerner through the subject of topography. All in all, the Linguistic Atlas plans to use its complex systems to study language in the future. These complex systems show us that you can predict that there will be a change in language, however, you cannot predict what exactly the change will be, since it is a continuous movement. It is evident that the Linguistic Atlas system has certainly innovated its methods over the years, so who knows what the researchers will be able to find in the next couple of decades.